They say the truth always comes out in the end, but sometimes justice takes the most unexpected path. Meet Ebony Johnson, a dedicated social worker and loving mother whose only crime was driving home from a late-night shift on the busy streets of Chicago. Unfortunately, a single traffic stop would forever alter the course of her life. The man behind the badge, Officer Reynolds, appeared to wear honor and duty on his sleeve, yet harbored a dangerous secret, a vicious prejudice that fueled his every move. Little did he know, a mysterious stranger was watching his every step, ready to turn the tables. Ebony Johnson had lived in Chicago her entire life. She grew up on the South Side, surrounded by tall brick buildings and the comforting aromas of home-cooked meals wafting through open windows. Community was everything. People looked out for each other. They shared warm greetings across rusting balconies and mailed letters for elderly neighbors who couldn't leave their apartments. Ebony's grandmother, known affectionately as Mama Janie, had been a pillar of that same community. She ran a tiny soul food spot off 79th Street, taught Ebony the importance of resilience, and believed that with grit and kindness, anyone could overcome even the darkest obstacles. Now Ebony was grown, with a daughter of her own, 4-year-old Kayla, who had inherited her mother's gentle eyes and her father's wide, dazzling smile. Ebony worked as a social worker at a local non-profit, tirelessly helping families navigate the labyrinth of resources available in the city. She believed that if someone didn't step up to help, entire communities could be left behind. That sense of duty kept her going, even when the nights were long and the pay left much to be desired. On a damp autumn night, Ebony stayed late at the center, sorting through housing assistance paperwork for a single mother in desperate need. The center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she organized folders, typed up case notes, and carefully double-checked deadlines. By the time she stepped out, it was well past midnight. Fatigue weighed down her shoulders as she walked to her old sedan, parked on a poorly lit corner. Rain drizzled from the sky, painting the street with a shimmering sheen. Her routine drive home was usually uneventful. She took the same route every night, passing the famed Harold's Chicken Shack on the corner, the local community church, and the 24-hour convenience store where she sometimes stopped for a quick coffee. But tonight, Ebony sensed something was off. She first noticed it in her rearview mirror, headlights following a little too closely, mirroring her lane changes, tailing her like a persistent shadow. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 12:48 a.m., telling herself it was just her imagination. Ebony switched lanes, hoping the car would pass. Instead, blue and red lights flared to life behind her. Her heart pounded as she realized it was a police cruiser. The sirens shattered the quiet night, an unmistakable command, "Pull over." Anxiety twisted Ebony's stomach into knots. She signaled and stopped beneath a flickering streetlight. "Stay calm," she whispered, reminding herself of Mama Janie's constant refrain, "Always remain calm and respectful. Keep your hands where they can see them." Despite this self-reassurance, she couldn't ignore the nagging sense of unease that had taken root. She rolled down her window as the officer strode toward her. Raindrops pricked his uniform, sliding down the dark blue fabric. His face was partially hidden under the rim of his hat, but the glare in his eyes told Ebony everything she needed to know. This was no routine stop for him. The name tag read, "Officer Reynolds." "License and registration," he barked, his voice low and stern. Ebony retrieved her driver's license from her purse and fumbled through the glove box for the registration. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely, even though her voice trembled slightly. Reynolds looked her over as though she were a criminal. "Broken taillight," he said curtly, giving the back of her car a dismissive glance. Ebony was certain her taillights were in good working order. Her father had helped her change the bulbs a few weeks back, and she double-checked them just last week. She opened her mouth to respond, but quickly decided against it. The tension emanating from the officer was palpable. Challenging him might only escalate the situation. Reynolds bent down, shining his flashlight across the back seat, peering over Kayla's booster seat and the neat stack of children's books. Ebony always carried around. He then turned it to Ebony's face, the bright beam almost blinding her. "Where you headed so late?" he asked, the suspicion in his tone barely disguised. "I'm heading home from work," Ebony replied softly. "I'm a social worker at Family Focus Chicago. You got any drugs or weapons in the vehicle?" Reynolds pressed on, ignoring her explanation. "No, sir," Ebony answered, confusion now edging into her voice. She kept her hands on the steering wheel, forcing herself to remain still and composed. Suddenly, Reynolds reached for the car door handle. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." Fear clamped around Ebony's chest. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears. She'd heard of these stops spiraling out of control, but Ebony had done nothing wrong. She quietly reminded herself to comply, not wanting to give the officer any reason to brandish force. She carefully opened the door and stepped outside into the drizzle. Reynolds immediately demanded she place her hands on the trunk. Ebony complied, her coat soaking up water as the cold air stung her skin. She heard him radio in her plates, her license number, and then wait. The silence on that lonely street felt eerie. The minutes ticked by. Ebony's mind ran through every possible scenario. Was there an error in the system? Had the license expired and she missed the renewal notice? But she was certain everything was in order. When Reynolds received no incriminating information from dispatch, he scowled. Ebony could see disappointment warring with frustration in his eyes like a fisherman who couldn't accept an empty net. At that moment, Ebony realized with growing dread that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. He wanted something to pin on her. He frisked her, patting down her arms and waist in a way that felt excessive. Then, with an air of grim resolve, he announced he was taking her into custody for resisting arrest. The words hit Ebony like a thunderbolt. Resisting arrest? She'd complied with his every directive, from handing over her license to stepping out of the car. She'd never raised her voice or made a threatening move. Before she could protest, Reynolds snapped handcuffs around her wrists. The cold metal bit into her skin. She felt a pang of humiliation as cars slowed to see what was happening. She was a woman with no criminal history, a mother who had spent her entire day helping others, now locked in cuffs for a crime she didn't commit. All because this officer seemed determined to arrest her. Reynolds practically shoved Ebony into the back seat of his cruiser. Her heart hammered as she watched the streetlights blur past through the rain-smeared windows. The world outside looked so normal, unaware of the nightmare unfolding. She thought of Kayla, sound asleep at home with Ebony's cousin. Who would pick her up in the morning? Who would help her get ready for preschool? Ebony choked back tears, determined not to break down in front of this man. At the station District 7, a branch of the Chicago Police, Reynolds paraded Ebony through processing like a prize trophy. He spoke loudly to other officers in the room, proclaiming he'd arrested a dangerous suspect who refused to comply with orders. Ebony tried to explain, tried to let someone know what really happened, but her voice was drowned out by Reynolds's authoritative tone and the inherent trust officers placed in one another. Finally, Ebony was placed in a holding cell, a stark grey room reeking of stale sweat and fear. A single bench lined the wall where she sat, trembling with a mixture of fury and anxiety. Another woman, who looked far more hardened by life's tribulations, paced at the far end of the cell. She eyed Ebony sympathetically, but said nothing. Time moved at a snail's pace. The whirring overhead light hummed, intensifying the silence. Eventually, a younger officer named Baker arrived to process her. He asked Ebony a series of standard questions. Name, age, address. Ebony answered automatically, her mind still stuck on the fact that she'd been arrested without reason. Baker's demeanor was neutral, almost bored, until Ebony finally mustered the courage to speak up. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said. "I didn't do anything to resist. Officer Reynolds just pulled me over and said I had a broken taillight. But I checked it. It wasn't broken, and then he arrested me." Baker paused, letting his pen hover above the form. "He said you resisted, that you tried to flee." "That's not true," she insisted, desperation creeping into her tone. "Please, can you check the dash or body camera footage? My record is clean. I work as a social worker. I have a little girl at home waiting for me." Baker met her gaze, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. But the protocol was clear. Ebony was booked, and the rest would be determined at a preliminary hearing. She would need to spend the night and appear before a judge at the Cook County Courthouse the next morning. The official charge: resisting arrest with potential for additional citations if an investigation uncovered them. Exhausted and devastated, Ebony sank onto the hard bench, arms wrapped around her waist. She wanted to fight back, but how? The justice system she'd always hoped would protect law-abiding citizens was now the very one threatening to destroy her life. Morning arrived slowly, and a weary Ebony was transported with other detainees to the courthouse. She shared the ride in a paddy wagon, handcuffed to a rail, each jolt sending pain through her wrists. In the stale, cramped space, she prayed for some miracle. She prayed for Kayla. She prayed for clarity, for hope. But Ebony had no idea that someone else had already begun working on her behalf, someone who had witnessed the entire stop from a distance. A figure from the shadows who carried a secret that could unravel Officer Reynolds's web of lies. 2 nights earlier, a private detective named Jordan O'Neill had been surveilling a nearby intersection for a completely unrelated case. Hired by a local journalist investigating alleged corruption, Jordan happened upon a peculiar sight. Officer Reynolds had stopped another driver, an older black man, for a supposed broken headlight. Jordan watched from across the street as Reynolds berated the man, slammed him against the trunk, and eventually let him go with a humiliating tongue lashing. There was a vindictive edge to Reynolds's method, as though he relished flexing his authority disproportionately. Jordan saw the same pattern repeating during Ebony's traffic stop. From a discreet vantage point, hidden in the darkness, Jordan recorded everything on a high-resolution camera. Ebony calmly handing over her license, no visible broken taillight, Officer Reynolds's aggressive posturing, and eventually Ebony being pulled out and arrested with no apparent cause. Jordan recognized the signs of a power-tripping officer abusing his authority. Driven by a sense of justice and perhaps a bit of curiosity, Jordan decided to do more than just watch. By the time Ebony arrived at the courthouse's holding area, Jordan was already in a nearby cafe, waiting for an old contact. This contact was a legal assistant at a reputable law firm on LaSalle Street. Jordan placed a small memory card on the table and slid it across. "You need to get this footage into the right hands pronto," Jordan said. The legal assistant, a petite woman named Carla, picked it up with trembling fingers. "This will blow up the whole case," Carla murmured, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the file on a laptop. "Wait, this is Ebony Johnson. She's being charged right now." "I know Ebony. She used to volunteer at our youth outreach events. She's the kindest soul." This is insane. The next step involved Carla racing back to the law firm and begging her boss to take Ebony's case pro bono. It didn't take much convincing. The firm's managing partner, Richard Abrams, was an advocate for civil rights, deeply troubled by the city's history of police misconduct. As soon as he saw the footage, he assembled a legal team to draft an emergency motion to dismiss Ebony's charges. Back at the courthouse, Ebony sat in a small side room, waiting for her name to be called. Her world felt like it was in free fall. She worried about Kayla and how frightened her daughter would be if Ebony didn't come home soon. Every passing minute hammered home the reality: an unscrupulous cop had the power to upend her life. When Ebony's turn finally arrived, she stood before the judge with trembling hands. Officer Reynolds was in the courtroom, looking smug. The prosecutor, presumably accustomed to trusting law enforcement, recited the formal charges: resisting arrest, potential disorderly conduct. Before Ebony's public defender could even form a coherent defense, the courtroom doors burst open. Richard Abrams and Carla walked in, carrying a folder thick with documents and a USB drive in hand. They apologized for the interruption but insisted it was urgent. The judge, a middle-aged woman with an austere countenance, eyed them with curiosity. She motioned them forward, giving them permission to speak. "We have crucial evidence that pertains directly to this case, Your Honor," Abrams stated. The tension in the courtroom shot up as he handed the judge the USB drive. Ebony watched, her heart racing. She had no idea what was on that drive or who these people were, yet a sliver of hope bloomed. Something was happening, something that might just save her. The judge permitted a brief recess to review the footage. The courtroom's overhead screens were used to play the recording. The grainy video showed Ebony's sedan pulling over. It captured Officer Reynolds's forceful tone, Ebony's calm compliance, and, most importantly, the fact that Ebony did nothing resembling resistance. Her hands were always visible. She never made an aggressive move. The camera's viewpoint clearly captured the moment Reynolds decided to arrest her anyway, forcing her arms behind her back and snapping on the cuffs. There was no sign of a broken taillight, no sign Ebony had committed any traffic infraction at all. A hush fell over the courtroom. Ebony closed her eyes, trying to keep the overwhelming mix of relief and anger at bay. Officer Reynolds's face went rigid, his jaw clenched, and sweat dotted his brow. He knew this spelled disaster for him. The judge's expression turned stony. Even the prosecutor recognized the magnitude of the lie that had been so brazenly presented in official reports. When the footage ended, the judge wasted no time. With a cold glare at Reynolds, she announced, "All charges against Miss Johnson are dismissed immediately." A wave of relief surged through Ebony's body. Her knees nearly buckled and tears formed in her eyes. She'd come so close to a fate that would have haunted her for years. Instead, she was free, but justice still had more to deliver. No sooner had the judge dismissed Ebony's charges than she ordered the prosecutor to begin an investigation into Officer Reynolds's conduct. "Falsifying reports," she said tersely, "is a grave violation. In this court, we do not tolerate perjury from anyone, especially an officer of the law." With that, Ebony's fate was reversed entirely. She was escorted out of the courtroom, not to return to her holding cell, but to the open arms of Carla and Richard Abrams, who guided her into a quiet hallway. Outside, Ebony barely managed to whisper her thanks. She glanced up at Abrams, whose distinguished face showed only calm determination. "I don't know how to thank you," she breathed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank Jordan O'Neill, the private detective who caught it all on camera," Abrams said. "And thank Carla, who made sure this got into my hands." Carla gave a tiny smile. "You helped me find a shelter for a family last year, Ebony. I never forgot your kindness." The moment was overwhelming. Ebony felt her world slowly shifting back into alignment, though the shock still lingered. Abrams then explained that they planned to file a civil suit against both the city and Officer Reynolds personally for wrongful arrest, emotional distress, and violation of civil rights. Ebony didn't want to think about a lawsuit yet. She just wanted to hug Kayla, but she also knew how important it was to hold officers accountable for misconduct to ensure this didn't happen to someone else. By the afternoon, Ebony was in a taxi heading home, the city skyline rising in the distance. She stared out the window as the streets she had always known now looked slightly different. The neon signage, The mosaic of cultures in each passing neighborhood, these familiar sights, felt less comforting now, marred by the realization that injustice could happen anywhere, anytime. Yet Ebony felt an ember of hope burn inside her. People like Jordan, Carla, and Richard existed. In a city often overshadowed by corruption, good people still fought for the truth. Over the following weeks, Ebony tried to resume her life. Word of her arrest spread quickly, especially in her neighborhood. Family and friends surrounded her with concern and prayers. Kayla was too young to understand the full scope, but she sensed her mother had gone through something terrifying. Ebony kept up a brave front, but at night, nightmares of that holding cell would rob her of sleep. Meanwhile, the legal gears began to churn. Abrams's firm filed an official lawsuit. This triggered an internal investigation at the Chicago Police Department. At first, Officer Reynolds tried to lie his way out, asserting that Ebony had tampered with the footage or that it was taken out of context. He claimed Ebony was belligerent and that the camera didn't capture the full exchange. He insisted the traffic stop was justified, the arrest was within protocol. Yet, with Jordan O'Neill's raw footage and an official statement from Ebony, the story took a dire turn for Reynolds. The department uncovered multiple complaints filed against him in the past, many by people of color. These complaints had largely been dismissed due to insufficient evidence, but now the weight of Ebony's case, combined with the damning video, forced the brass at the station to confront Reynolds's questionable record. A turning point came when Officer Baker, the young officer who had processed Ebony, found the courage to speak out. He admitted to hearing Reynolds boast about cleaning up the streets of certain neighborhoods. He disclosed that Reynolds had bragged about being able to plant evidence if necessary, just to make sure these people stay in their place. Baker handed over text messages to the Internal Affairs Unit, in which Reynolds used racial slurs and celebrated the power. His badge gave him over minorities. This was the final nail in the coffin of Reynolds's career. Public outrage exploded once local news stations picked up the story. The footage circulated on social media, fueling discussions about racial profiling and police reform. Ebony's nightmare, ironically, led to a much larger debate in Chicago about oversight, accountability, and trust between the community and law enforcement. Eventually, Reynolds was suspended, then fired. Criminal charges followed, falsifying police reports, misconduct, and even the potential for civil rights violations under federal scrutiny. The once confident officer who swaggered around the station was reduced to a defendant in a high-profile trial. At each court appearance, he encountered the same stares of disbelief and disgust that he once directed at suspects. The men and women in uniform who had once given him the benefit of the doubt now distanced themselves, ashamed by his actions and the damage done to their department's credibility. Throughout all this upheaval, Ebony remained gracious and composed. She continued her social work, focusing on reuniting children with their parents, placing families in stable housing, and helping those who felt invisible or powerless. Her own personal ordeal gave her a new perspective. She knew intimately what it felt like to be voiceless and terrified. She used this insight to connect more deeply with her clients, offering them empathy and reassurance. But Ebony also joined a coalition advocating for police accountability reforms. She attended community meetings, speaking out about her experience. She emphasized that not all officers were like Reynolds. There were plenty of good cops who genuinely cared about the community. However, if departments refused to weed out the bad apples, more people like Ebony would be traumatized. Her voice added to the growing call for body-worn camera transparency and stricter disciplinary actions for misconduct. Jordan O'Neill had quietly watched the story unfold from the sidelines. A private detective by trade, Jordan preferred to keep a low profile. But Ebony was determined to find and thank the person who'd saved her from a cruel fate. After multiple inquiries, Ebony finally tracked Jordan down at a modest office near the Loop, where a small plate on the door read, "O'Neill Investigations." Their meeting was a quiet, heartfelt exchange. Ebony was struck by Jordan's unassuming presence. She had pictured a detective as a grizzled figure in a trench coat. Jordan was instead a calm, methodical individual who simply believed in doing the right thing. Over cups of coffee, Ebony poured out her gratitude, tears shimmering at the corners of her eyes. Jordan accepted her thanks with humility. "It was just luck that I was out there that night," Jordan said, running a hand over a laptop that had recorded so many glimpses of corruption. "If I can help rectify even one injustice, it makes the long hours worthwhile." They spoke about Ebony's plan to keep advocating for community empowerment, for bridging the divide between law enforcement and residents, and for removing corrupt officers. Jordan promised to keep Ebony in the loop if any further evidence against Reynolds or others like him emerged. A quiet alliance formed between them, rooted not just in the memory of a single night, but in the shared belief that vigilance and compassion could safeguard the city they both called home. Months passed, and the city's simmering tension around police misconduct reached new heights. When Reynolds finally went to trial, Ebony was called to testify. She sat in the witness box, her hands gripping the edges of the wooden seat. She recounted the events of that grim night, the traffic stop, the baseless accusations, the humiliating arrest. Then Abrams played the footage again, this time for a jury. Each frame of the recording was like a hammer blow to Reynolds' defense. Reynolds' attorney tried to sow doubt about the authenticity of the footage, questioning the vantage point, the timing, even Jordan's credibility, but the evidence was too strong, too irrefutable. Witnesses from Ebony's neighborhood also testified. They'd had run-ins with Reynolds. Some had filed complaints that never went anywhere. Their stories painted a chilling portrait of a man who used his power as a weapon, terrorizing the very community he was sworn to protect. At one point, the defense tried to argue that Ebony's arrest was a mistake, claiming Reynolds had been on high alert, believing Ebony might be connected to a local drug ring. The prosecution promptly dismantled that argument by showing Ebony's spotless record and emphasizing Reynolds' pattern of targeting innocent people. Baker's testimony was the final blow, an insider's account that Reynolds had boasted about teaching people a lesson. In the end, the jury found Reynolds guilty of multiple counts of official misconduct and falsifying police reports. Sentencing day arrived with the glare of cameras outside the courthouse, throngs of reporters seeking a comment. Ebony sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, longing for closure. The judge handed Reynolds a prison sentence, sending shockwaves through the city. Most former officers convicted of misconduct in the city had received minimal punishment in the past. This time, the system delivered a harsher consequence. As Reynolds was led away in handcuffs, a mirror image of the way he had led Ebony away that terrifying night, she exhaled a breath. She felt she'd been holding for months. She closed her eyes, recalling the dread she'd felt in the back seat of Reynolds' cruiser. Now, he was the one being taken to a cell. And it wasn't just about revenge. It was about accountability, about making it clear that no one, not even an officer, could act with impunity. In the wake of the verdict, Ebony became something of a local advocate. She spoke at churches, neighborhood gatherings, and even schools about civic responsibility, urging people to know their rights and not to stay silent in the face of injustice. The settlement from the civil lawsuit also helped Ebony stabilize her own future. She upgraded her car without a single broken taillight and put a down payment on a small condo in a safer neighborhood for Kayla. Mama Janie would have been proud. Ebony reflected on that often, especially on days when the weight of her experience still pressed heavily on her. Kayla, bright and giggly, provided a beacon of hope. She would grow up in a city that was making small, yet significant strides toward fairness. Maybe the wheels of progress turned slowly, but they did turn. And Jordan? The detective remained a discreet ally. Occasionally, Jordan called Ebony with updates on any other officers under suspicion, sometimes asking Ebony's input on how best to reach out to victims. Over coffee in local diners, they would brainstorm ways to strengthen community oversight, how to encourage more civilians to step forward when they encountered wrongdoing. Their unlikely friendship became a testament to the bond that can form when two people share a commitment to truth. On one rainy afternoon, eerily reminiscent of the night Ebony was arrested, she stood beneath a blue umbrella in front of the Cook County Courthouse. She looked up at the imposing facade. The building had once been a place of her darkest humiliation, but now it was also the backdrop against which she had reclaimed her dignity. With a deep breath, Ebony stepped forward, heading inside to attend a meeting on police accountability reforms. A small crowd of activists gathered in the hallway, discussing new proposals. She joined them, a quiet but unwavering presence, determined to help shape a future where no one else would endure what she had. In the end, Ebony realized that justice wasn't a single triumph. It was an ongoing effort, a shared endeavor requiring vigilance from every corner of the community. And while she had faced the brutality of a broken system, she had also witnessed the grace of individuals who refused to let injustice win. Ebony vowed she would forever stand on that side of the fight, protecting, uplifting, and ensuring that hope was never just a distant flicker, but a bright, unwavering flame. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through Ebony's story, a tale that reminds us how darkness can creep into the most ordinary moments, but also how light can emerge from the unlikeliest places. While one individual's courage brought a crooked officer to justice, the true victory belongs to every voice raised against wrongdoing. Let this account serve as an inspiration for staying vigilant, for speaking out, and for standing tall in the face of injustice. If this story resonated with you, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement helps us continue bringing real-life stories, both the painful and the hopeful, to a wider audience. Together, we can create a community that values truth, empathy, and justice. Don't forget to hit that notification bell and stay tuned for more stories that shine a spotlight on the power of unity and unwavering resolve.